The silence that followed the Wizengamot's final vote still rang in Amelia Bone's ears as she made her way through the ministry corridors. The sound of her heels against the polished stone floors echoed with each measured step, a steady rhythm that matched the persistent questions circling in her mind. Harry Potter had been cleared of all charges, as was proper and just, but something about the entire proceeding left her unsettled in ways she could not yet name. She paused before the lifts, watching the golden grills slide shut on another car filled with ministry workers heading home for the evening. The hearing had run late, past the time when most decent people should have been sitting down to dinner with their families. Yet here she stood, alone with her thoughts and a growing sense that justice, while served today, had revealed something darker lurking beneath its surface. The boy's Patronus haunted her still. Not the fact that he could produce one, though that was impressive enough for a wizard of merely 15 years, but the desperate quality with which he had described its casting. When pressed to explain how he had managed such advanced magic under duress, Harry Potter had spoken with the kind of quiet intensity that came from genuine fear. Not the performative anxiety of a young person caught breaking rules, but something deeper. Something that spoke of experience with real danger, real consequences. Amelia stepped into the next available lift, nodding curtly to the operator, who barely glanced up from his evening edition of the Prophet. The headline screamed about Potter's vindication, painting Cornelius in an unflattering light that would no doubt sour his mood for weeks to come. But she found herself caring less about political ramifications and more about the questions that had gone unasked during the formal proceedings. How did a 15-year-old boy learn to cast a corporeal Patronus? The spell required not merely technical skill, but a deep well of positive emotion to draw upon, happy memories powerful enough to hold against the darkness. In her years as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Amelia had encountered plenty of young wizards who struggled with far simpler magic when under pressure. Yet Potter had managed something that challenged fully trained Aurors, and he had done it to protect his cousin. The lift shuddered to a stop at level 2, and Amelia walked the familiar path to her office. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement never truly slept, but at this hour it had settled into the quieter rhythms of evening duty. Junior clerks shuffled between filing cabinets, and the occasional Auror passed by with the measured gait of someone either arriving for night shift or finally heading home after a long day. She acknowledged their respectful nods with the same professional courtesy she had maintained for decades in these corridors. Her office door bore her name in neat gilt lettering, a simple statement of authority that she had never felt the need to embellish. Inside, the space reflected her practical nature. Functional furniture, well-organized files, and a few personal touches that spoke to a life spent in service rather than luxury. The window overlooked the atrium, offering a view of the steady stream of ministry workers and visitors that flowed through the great space even at this late hour. Amelia settled behind her desk and pulled the official transcript of Potter's hearing toward her. She had, of course, been present for every moment of the proceedings, but sometimes reviewing the cold facts in writing revealed details that emotion or political theatre might have obscured. The boy's responses were recorded with typical bureaucratic precision, each question and answer noted in stark black ink. Yet reading his testimony again, she found herself paying attention not to what was said, but to what had been left unsaid. When asked about his living situation, Potter's responses had been brief, almost perfunctory. He lived with his aunt and uncle in Little Whinging, Surrey. They were muggles. They provided him with room and board during school holidays, all perfectly reasonable answers delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested they had been rehearsed. But there had been something in his posture during those questions that struck her as odd. Not defiance, exactly, but a kind of guarded tension that seemed disproportionate to such routine inquiries. Most young people, when asked about their families, displayed some warmth, or at least casual familiarity. Potter had spoken of the Dursleys as if they were strangers whose hospitality he accepted out of necessity rather than affection. She set the transcript aside and leaned back in her chair, allowing herself to consider possibilities that went beyond the formal scope of the hearing. The boy lived with Muggles, relatives on his mother's side. That much was well established, and had never been questioned by anyone in an official capacity. But what kind of life was it really, for a wizard of Potter's obvious talents to spend his summers in a world that feared and misunderstood magic? Amelia had grown up in a magical household, surrounded by people who understood her abilities and encouraged their development. Even during the years when her brother Edgar had been pursuing his own career in the department, their family dinners had been filled with discussions of spells and potions, of the fascinating complexities of magical lore and the challenges facing their community. She could not imagine what it might be like to return, summer after summer, to people who viewed her very existence as an aberration. More troubling still was the question of how Potter had come to face Dementors in Little Whinging at all. The official report had been clear on the facts. 2 of the foul creatures had somehow escaped their usual bounds and attacked the boy and his cousin in an underpass. But Dementors did not simply wander about the countryside on their own initiative. They were drawn to despair, to hopelessness, to the kind of deep emotional wounds that festered in darkness. What had drawn them to Privet Drive? The thought struck her with uncomfortable force. If Potter's home environment was generating the kind of misery that attracted Dementors, then the boy's living situation might be far more problematic than anyone had realized. And if that were the case, then the Ministry, her department specifically, had a responsibility to investigate. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began drafting a preliminary inquiry request. Nothing dramatic or accusatory, just a routine follow-up to ensure the welfare of an underage wizard who had recently encountered dangerous magical creatures in a Muggle area. It was the sort of bureaucratic procedure that happened dozens of times each year, unremarkable enough that it would attract no political attention, while still providing her with the authority to ask more pointed questions. But even as she wrote, Amelia found herself hoping that her suspicions were unfounded. Harry Potter had already endured more tragedy in his short life than most wizards faced in their entire careers. If his refuge with the Dursleys was not the safe haven everyone assumed it to be, then the boy who had already lost so much might be suffering in ways that none of them had bothered to discover. The quill scratched steadily against the parchment as she formulated her request, each word chosen with the careful precision of someone who understood that bureaucracy could be either a shield for the vulnerable or a weapon against them. Tonight, she intended it to serve the former purpose. If Potter needed help, she would find a way to provide it. If not, then a brief investigation would confirm his well-being and allow everyone to rest easier. Either way, she would have answers. And in her experience, the questions that kept you awake at night were usually the ones most worth pursuing. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Amelia's office with the pale quality that spoke of autumn's approach. She had arrived earlier than usual, her preliminary inquiry request from the night before having crystallized into something more concrete as she lay wakeful in her bed, turning over the implications of what she might discover. The parchment sat on her desk now, signed and sealed, ready to set bureaucratic wheels in motion that would be difficult to stop once they began turning. But bureaucracy, for all its eventual power, moved with the ponderous weight of established procedure. What she needed now was information, and information required more direct methods than filing requests and waiting for responses. She had spent her career understanding that the difference between justice and mere law often came down to knowing which questions to ask before the formal machinery of government began grinding toward its predetermined conclusions. The files she had requested sat before her in neat stacks, each one representing a different avenue of approach to the Potter question. Hogwarts maintained extensive records on all its students, not merely their academic progress, but their general welfare during term time. The school's duty of care, while limited to the months when children were under its direct supervision, still generated the kind of documentation that might reveal patterns a trained investigator could recognize. She opened the first file with the careful attention of someone who understood that important truths often hid in mundane details. Potter's academic records showed the expected pattern of a competent student who excelled in defense against the dark arts while struggling somewhat with potions. His participation in Quidditch was noted with the kind of administrative pride that suggested the school valued his athletic contributions, all perfectly normal for a young wizard finding his place in the magical world. But it was the smaller notations that caught her attention as she read more carefully. References to injuries that seemed more frequent than typical schoolboy accidents. A pattern of arriving at school each September in a state that required immediate attention to his general health and nutrition. Comments from staff about his apparent reluctance to discuss his holiday experiences, his tendency to deflect questions about his home life with humor or subject changes. None of these observations were dramatic enough to warrant official concern on their own. Plenty of students struggled with homesickness, or had difficulty adjusting between the magical and muggle worlds, or simply preferred to keep their family circumstances private. But taken together, they painted a picture that aligned uncomfortably with her growing suspicions about the nature of Potter's summer arrangements. More telling still were the gaps in the record. For a student who had survived the killing curse as an infant, who bore a scar that marked him as unique in the wizarding world, there was remarkably little documentation of special care or attention to his psychological well-being. No mentions of counseling to help him process the trauma of his early loss. No notes about monitoring his adjustment to learning the truth about his heritage. It was as if everyone simply assumed that surviving Voldemort had somehow prepared him to handle everything else life might offer. Amelia set the academic files aside and reached for the more sensitive material she had obtained through her position as head of the department. These records required higher clearance to access, the kind of information that spoke to security concerns and protection protocols rather than educational achievement. Here, she expected to find evidence of the careful monitoring that surely surrounded someone of Potter's significance to their community. What she found instead was a troubling absence of oversight. Beyond the basic ward monitoring that tracked his location during the summer months, there appeared to be no systematic evaluation of his living conditions. The blood protection that kept him safe from dark magical threats was well documented and carefully maintained, but no one seemed to have considered that protection from external enemies might not address all forms of harm a young person could face. The ward reports themselves made for unsettling reading when viewed through the lens of her new concerns. The magical signature they tracked was consistently weaker during the summer months, a phenomenon that had been noted but not investigated. In a healthy wizard of Potter's age and ability, such fluctuation might indicate periods of magical suppression or emotional distress. Yet the reports treated these dips as unremarkable, something to be monitored but not explored. She was reaching for her quill to make additional notes when a soft knock at her door interrupted her concentration. The sound carried the particular rhythm that meant one of her senior staff needed to speak with her, important enough to warrant interruption, but not urgent enough to bypass courtesy entirely. "Come," she called, and was pleased to see Nymphadora Tonks enter with the kind of purposeful energy that marked her as one of the department's most capable young Aurors. At 22, Tonks brought a combination of natural talent and unconventional thinking that had already proven valuable in several delicate investigations. Her metamorph magus abilities made her particularly useful for surveillance work that required discretion. "Morning, ma'am," Tonks said, settling into the chair across from Amelia's desk with the easy confidence of someone who had earned her place through merit rather than connections. Her hair was a sensible brown this morning, professional enough for official business, but still carrying that slight wave that suggested she chose this appearance deliberately rather than accepting whatever genetics had provided. "I have an assignment that will require both your particular skills and your discretion," Amelia began, choosing her words with the care she always used when briefing her people on sensitive matters. "There are some concerns about the welfare of Harry Potter during his summer residence with his Muggle relatives. I need someone to conduct surveillance of his living situation, gather information about his daily circumstances, and assess whether intervention might be warranted." Something shifted in Tonks's expression, a flicker of recognition that went beyond mere professional interest. Amelia noted it, but chose not to probe immediately. Many of her staff had opinions about Potter, given his prominence in recent events and the various rumors that circulated about his circumstances. What mattered now was whether Tonks could approach the assignment with the objectivity it required. "You understand that this investigation must remain completely confidential," she continued. "If there are problems with Potter's living arrangements, we need to understand their full scope before taking any action. Premature intervention could compromise his safety in ways that would be difficult to correct." "Of course, ma'am," Tonks replied, and Amelia heard in her voice the kind of professional commitment that transcended personal feelings. "What specific concerns should I be looking for?" Amelia consulted the notes she had compiled during her morning's research. The documented patterns that had emerged from official sources painted a disturbing picture when assembled with proper attention to their implications. It was time to give that picture the weight of official investigation. "Previous records suggest possible neglect or emotional abuse," she said, allowing the clinical terms to carry their full weight. "Inadequate nutrition during summer months, social isolation, restrictions on his movement and activities that go beyond reasonable precautions. There are also indications that he may be subjected to verbal or psychological mistreatment by his guardians." She paused, watching Tonks process this information with the kind of focused attention that confirmed her choice of investigator had been sound. "Your role will be to observe the household dynamics, document any evidence of mistreatment, and assess Potter's general well-being without alerting the family to your presence. Can you manage extended surveillance in a Muggle neighborhood without detection?" "Shouldn't be a problem," Tonks said, and Amelia caught the slight edge in her voice that suggested this assignment had become personally significant. "Little Whinging is the sort of place where new faces get noticed, but with the right appearance and cover story, I can blend in long enough to get what we need." "Good. I want daily reports, but use the secure channels we established for the Fudge investigation. If you discover evidence of immediate physical danger, contact me directly, regardless of the hour. Otherwise, maintain observation until you have enough information to support formal action if it becomes necessary." Tonks stood, her posture carrying the kind of determination that reminded Amelia why she had risen so quickly through the department's ranks despite her youth. "How long do I have for this assignment?" "As long as it takes," Amelia replied. "But given the sensitivity of the situation, I'd prefer to have preliminary findings within the week. Potter's safety may depend on how quickly we can determine the truth of his circumstances." After Tonks had left, Amelia returned to her files with renewed focus. The investigation was now officially underway, moving from suspicion into the realm of active intelligence gathering. Whatever they discovered in Little Whinging would determine whether Harry Potter's summer refuge was the sanctuary everyone assumed, or something far more troubling that had been overlooked for far too long. The morning mist clung to the pristine lawns of Privet Drive with the persistence of something that belonged in this orderly suburban world, where conformity was not merely preferred, but enforced through the silent pressure of neighborhood expectations. Nymphadora Tonks stood at the corner where Privet Drive met Magnolia Road, her appearance carefully crafted to blend into the background of this relentlessly ordinary street. She had chosen the form of a middle-aged woman with sensibly cut brown hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested someone who might be visiting elderly relatives or conducting business with local tradespeople. The transformation had become second nature after years of aura training, but maintaining it while conducting extended surveillance required a different kind of focus than the brief changes she used for undercover work. Here, she needed to inhabit this borrowed identity completely, to move and speak and react as if she truly belonged in this world of manicured hedges and net curtains that twitched at the slightest disturbance to the established routine. Number 4. Privet Drive sat squat and solid in its row, indistinguishable from its neighbors, save for the brass number that gleamed with the kind of obsessive polish that spoke to deep-seated anxiety about appearances. The house proclaimed its respectability through every carefully maintained detail, from the pristine white paintwork to the garden that showed no trace of weeds or wildness. It was, Tonks thought with growing unease, exactly the sort of place where unpleasant truths might fester behind facades of desperate normalcy. She had been watching for 3 days now, establishing patterns and routines that would allow her to understand the household dynamics without alerting its inhabitants to her presence. The surveillance had revealed a family structure that operated with military precision, each member following schedules that seemed designed to minimize contact with one another rather than foster any sense of domestic warmth or affection. The man of the house left each morning at precisely 7:30, his broad frame squeezed into business attire that emphasized his prosperity while doing little to flatter his appearance. He moved with the aggressive purposefulness of someone who had built his identity around material success and expected the world to acknowledge his importance accordingly. His wife followed a different rhythm, emerging only for specific errands that seemed calculated to maintain her standing in whatever social hierarchies governed this sterile neighborhood. But it was the boy who commanded Tonks' professional attention, and what she observed filled her with a cold anger that she struggled to contain behind her borrowed appearance. Harry Potter, the wizard who had faced down Dementors and survived the killing curse, moved through his supposed home like a prisoner serving an indefinite sentence for crimes he could not name. His daily routine spoke of restrictions that went far beyond reasonable precautions for a young person's safety. He appeared in the garden only for specific chores, working with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned that drawing attention to himself would bring consequences he preferred to avoid. The tasks themselves were menial labor inappropriate for a guest in any household, let alone a family member whose presence should have been welcomed rather than merely tolerated. More troubling still was the boy's physical condition. Even from a distance, Tonks could see that his clothes hung loose on a frame that should have been filling out with the robust health of adolescence. His movements carried a careful quality that suggested he had learned to make himself small, to take up minimal space and attract minimal notice from the adults who should have been caring for his well-being. On the second day of surveillance, she witnessed an interaction that confirmed her worst suspicions about the nature of Potter's summer arrangements. The boy had been working in the garden when he accidentally disturbed a carefully maintained flower bed, causing several blooms to fall onto the pristine pathway. His reaction was immediate and telling, not the mild concern of someone who had made an innocent mistake, but the sharp fear of someone who understood that such errors carried disproportionate consequences. When the woman emerged from the house moments later, her response validated Potter's apparent anxiety. The verbal assault that followed was delivered with the kind of vicious precision that spoke to years of practice in finding the words that would inflict maximum emotional damage while leaving no physical evidence of abuse. The boy accepted this treatment with a resignation that was far more disturbing than anger or defiance would have been, suggesting that such incidents were routine rather than exceptional. Tonks had seen enough domestic abuse cases during her training to recognize the patterns, but witnessing it applied to Harry Potter created a cognitive dissonance that took considerable effort to process. This was the wizard who had stood before the Wizengamot and defended his use of the Patronus charm with quiet dignity, who had faced questions from senior ministry officials without visible intimidation. Yet here, in what should have been his sanctuary, he displayed the careful submission of someone who had learned that resistance brought punishment, while compliance merely delayed it. The documentation she compiled over 3 days of observation painted a picture that aligned perfectly with the concerns Amelia Bones had expressed during their initial briefing. The evidence of emotional abuse was clear and consistent, from the verbal attacks she witnessed to the social isolation that kept Potter separated from any potential sources of support or intervention. The physical neglect was more subtle but equally damaging, manifesting in inadequate nutrition and living conditions that suggested his comfort and well-being were not priorities for his guardians. By the 4th morning, she had gathered sufficient evidence to support formal intervention, but professional caution demanded that she verify her observations through additional surveillance before making her report. It was during this extended watch that she witnessed the incident that transformed her investigation from routine evidence gathering into something approaching an emergency response situation. Potter had been assigned the task of cleaning windows on the upper floor of the house, work that required him to lean out at dangerous angles while balancing precariously on a ladder that showed signs of significant wear. The equipment was clearly inadequate for the task, and the boy's unfamiliarity with such physical labor made the situation even more hazardous. When he lost his grip on the cleaning supplies and sent them crashing to the pavement below, the response from inside the house was immediate and explosive. The man who emerged was in a state of rage that seemed disproportionate to the minor accident that had triggered it. His verbal assault carried clearly across the street, and Tonks found herself gripping her surveillance equipment with white knuckles as she watched Potter endure threats and accusations that no child should have to hear from the adults responsible for his care. But it was the casual mention of punishment that involved restricting food that finally pushed her beyond the limits of professional detachment. She had what she needed, more than enough evidence to justify immediate action, and a growing certainty that delay could put Potter at risk of escalating abuse. The surveillance phase of the investigation was complete, and it was time to bring her findings to Amelia Bones with the urgency they deserved. That evening, she sat in her small flat in London, carefully organizing her notes and photographic evidence into a comprehensive report that would support whatever action Amelia deemed necessary. The documentation told a story of systematic mistreatment that had likely been ongoing for years, hidden behind the facade of respectability that the Dursley household presented to the outside world. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote the final summary, anger and professional disgust warring with the satisfaction of knowing that Potter's suffering would soon end. The boy who had saved their world from Dementors deserved better than this, and she intended to ensure he received the protection and care that had been denied him for far too long. tomorrow she would present her findings to Amelia Bones and recommend immediate intervention. Tonight, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had witnessed and to hope that they were not already too late to make a meaningful difference in Harry Potter's life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Amelia's office as she spread Tonks's surveillance photographs across her desk, each image telling a story that no amount of bureaucratic language could soften or disguise. The documentation was methodical and thorough, presenting evidence of systematic abuse with the kind of clinical precision that would satisfy any court of law. But looking at these pictures of Harry Potter, a 15-year-old wizard reduced to the status of unwelcome burden in his own supposed home, she felt the cold fury that had driven her to pursue justice for nearly 3 decades in magical law enforcement. The boy in these photographs bore little resemblance to the confident young wizard who had faced the Wizengamot just days earlier. Here, caught in unguarded moments by Tonks' careful surveillance, he appeared diminished in ways that went beyond mere physical appearance. His posture spoke of someone who had learned to make himself invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might bring consequences he could not escape. The careful way he moved around the adults in his household suggested a relationship built on fear rather than the natural affection that should exist between family members. Tonks' written report provided context that made the photographs even more damning. The systematic isolation, the verbal abuse, the assignment of inappropriate labor that seemed designed more to humiliate than to teach responsibility. All of it painted a picture of a household where Harry Potter existed not as a cherished family member, but as an unwanted obligation to be endured rather than embraced. Most troubling of all were the documented restrictions on his food and movement, evidence of control mechanisms that went far beyond reasonable discipline for a teenager. The boy who had produced a corporeal Patronus to save his cousin's life was being treated as if his very existence was a source of shame that needed to be hidden from the wider world. Amelia set the photographs aside and reached for the legal precedents she had researched throughout the previous evening. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement's authority to investigate crimes involving wizard children was well established, particularly when those crimes occurred in mixed magical muggle environments. The precedent of the Gaunt arrests provided clear legal justification for intervention when magical individuals were threatened by muggle households, and Potter's status as an underage wizard placed him squarely under the department's protection. But this case carried complications that went far beyond standard abuse investigations. The blood protection that kept Potter safe from dark magical threats was tied directly to his residence with his mother's family, a complex magical arrangement that had been carefully constructed and maintained for 14 years. Any action that removed him permanently from Privet Drive would break that protection, potentially exposing him to dangers far more severe than domestic abuse. She had spent hours reviewing the magical theory behind the protection, consulting texts that dated back centuries and confirmed the ancient nature of the magic involved. The bond created by Lily Potter's sacrifice, sealed by Petunia Dursley's acceptance of responsibility for her sister's child, formed a shield that had protected Harry from Voldemort's direct influence throughout his childhood. While he could call Privet Drive home, that protection remained intact. The moment he was removed permanently, or came to view somewhere else as his true home, the magical barrier would collapse. It was this complication that had kept her awake through most of the night, weighing the immediate need to protect Potter from ongoing abuse against the longer-term security that his current situation provided. The boy faced real danger from his relatives, but removing him from their custody might expose him to even greater threats from the dark forces that had been hunting him since infancy. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation, and she looked up to see Tonks entering with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she had spent her own sleepless hours processing what she had witnessed during the surveillance operation. "Mum," Tonks began, settling into the familiar chair across from Amelia's desk. "I've been thinking about the protection issue." Amelia gestured for her to continue, interested in hearing whether her subordinate's analysis would align with her own concerns about the magical complications their intervention might create. "The blood protection only works as long as Potter considers Privet Drive his home," Tonks said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had researched the magical theory thoroughly. "But from what I observed, he already doesn't think of that place as home in any meaningful sense. He's surviving there, not living there. The protection might be more fragile than we think." It was a perceptive observation, one that added another layer of complexity to an already difficult decision. If Potter's emotional connection to Privet Drive had already been severed by years of mistreatment, then the protection might already be compromised. In that case, intervention would carry fewer magical risks while addressing immediate physical and emotional dangers. "There's something else," Tonks continued, and Amelia heard in her voice the kind of controlled anger that came from witnessing injustice firsthand. The way his relatives treat him, the complete absence of any affection or care, that's not the behavior of people who accepted responsibility for his well-being. That's the behavior of people who were forced into a situation they resented and have spent years taking out their frustration on a child who had no choice in the arrangement. Amelia nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Tonks's assessment. The original placement of Potter with the Dursleys had been presented as a family taking in their orphaned nephew, but the reality appeared to be something closer to a prison sentence imposed on both parties. Whatever magical protections that arrangement had provided, it had clearly failed to create the loving home environment that should have been Potter's birthright. "I've reviewed the legal precedents," she said, pulling her research toward the center of the desk. "We have clear authority to intervene in cases where magical children are endangered by their guardians. The evidence you've gathered provides more than sufficient justification for formal action." She paused, considering the operational challenges that such action would require. However, this cannot be a standard domestic abuse intervention. Potter's significance to our community, combined with the magical protections involved, means we need to approach this carefully. We'll need a team capable of handling both the immediate situation and any magical complications that might arise. Tonks leaned forward, and Amelia saw in her expression the kind of professional readiness that had marked her as one of the department's most reliable operatives. "What kind of team are we looking at?" "Experienced Aurors with backgrounds in both domestic intervention and magical protection work," Amelia replied, already mentally reviewing the personnel files of her senior staff. "People who can maintain professional calm while dealing with potentially hostile muggles, and who understand the sensitivity of removing a high-profile wizard child from his guardians." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the steady flow of ministry workers beginning their daily routines. Somewhere in Little Whinging, Harry Potter was likely starting another day of the systematic mistreatment that Tonks had so carefully documented. The time for investigation and analysis had passed. It was time for action. "I want you to select a team of 5 additional operatives," she said, turning back to face Tonks. "Experienced personnel with clean records and the discretion to handle sensitive operations. Brief them on the magical protection complications and ensure they understand that this intervention could have implications far beyond the immediate welfare of one child." Tonks nodded, already reaching for her notes to begin the selection process. "Timeline?" 24 hours, Amelia replied, feeling the weight of decision settling into certainty. "I want the warrant prepared, the team briefed, and operational plans finalized. Potter has endured this situation long enough, and every day we delay increases the risk that his situation will deteriorate further. After Tonks had left to begin assembling the intervention team, Amelia returned to her desk and the photographs that had crystallized her determination to act. The boy in these images deserved better than the life he had been given, and it was her responsibility to ensure he received the protection that should have been his from the beginning. The magical protections might be complex, and the political ramifications significant, but sometimes justice required accepting such complications in service of a larger moral imperative. Harry Potter would be removed from Privet Drive, and the adults who had failed in their duty of care would face the consequences of their choices. It was time to set the wheels of justice in motion. The official ministry correspondence arrived with the measured precision that characterized all communication from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But Albus Dumbledore felt his heart sink as he recognized the formal seal pressed into the dark red wax. In his 114 years, he had received enough such letters to understand that their arrival invariably signaled the intersection of bureaucratic necessity with personal consequence, and he suspected that this particular message would prove more personally consequential than most. He set the letter aside momentarily, allowing himself the luxury of a few additional seconds before confronting whatever complications it contained. The morning had begun peacefully enough in his office, with the familiar comfort of administrative routine and the gentle presence of Fawkes preening his magnificent plumage in the golden light that streamed through the tall windows. It was the kind of quiet moment that had become increasingly rare since Voldemort's return, and he had been savoring the temporary respite from the constant vigilance that leadership of the Order of the Phoenix required. But peace, he had learned over the decades, was always temporary, and duty had a way of intruding on even the most carefully guarded moments of tranquility. With the resignation of someone who understood that avoiding unpleasant news only postponed rather than prevented its impact, he broke the ministry seal and unfolded the parchment that would almost certainly complicate his carefully maintained arrangements for Harry Potter's protection. The letter's contents exceeded even his pessimistic expectations. Amelia Bones, in her capacity as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was formally notifying him of an active investigation into the welfare of Harry Potter during his residence with his Muggle relatives. The language was diplomatically neutral, but the implications were unmistakable. Someone at the ministry had developed concerns about Harry's treatment at Privet Drive, and those concerns had reached the level of official scrutiny. Dumbledore set the letter down with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of decisions he had hoped never to confront directly. For 14 years, he had maintained the careful balance between Harry's immediate welfare and his long-term survival, accepting compromises that he knew would exact their own toll on the boy's development and happiness. The blood protection that kept Harry safe from Voldemort's direct influence required him to remain with Petunia Dursley, his mother's sister, in circumstances that Dumbledore had always known were less than ideal. But less than ideal had proven to be a considerable understatement, as he had gradually come to understand through his careful monitoring of the situation. The Dursleys' resentment of magic, their fear of anything that reminded them of the magical world that had claimed Petunia's sister, had manifested in treatment of Harry that went far beyond mere neglect. Dumbledore had known and had chosen to accept the knowledge as the price of keeping Harry alive until he was old enough to face the destiny that awaited him. It was a decision that haunted his quieter moments, when the press of immediate crises gave way to reflection on the choices he had made and their consequences for the people he claimed to protect. Harry Potter, the boy he had placed with the Dursleys to save him from Voldemort, had paid for that salvation in years of loneliness, mistreatment, and emotional isolation. The protection had worked exactly as intended, keeping the boy alive and hidden from his enemies, but it had exacted costs that Dumbledore had calculated and accepted with the cold pragmatism that leadership sometimes demanded. Now, it seemed, those costs had attracted the attention of someone with both the authority and the determination to challenge his carefully constructed arrangements. Amelia Bones was not a woman given to frivolous investigations, and her involvement suggested that the evidence against the Dursleys was substantial enough to warrant serious consideration of intervention. The irony was not lost on him that Harry's safety from one form of harm had exposed him to another, and that the magical protection designed to preserve his life had made him vulnerable to the kind of systematic mistreatment that would have been unthinkable in any magical household. The boy who could not be touched by Voldemort's magic could be damaged in ways that were perhaps more insidious, if less immediately lethal, by the very people charged with his care. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his brooding, and he looked up to see Minerva McGonagall entering with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she already knew something of why he had requested her presence. Her expression carried the particular blend of concern and determination that he had learned to associate with her most formidable moods, and he suspected that the conversation ahead would prove as challenging as the letter that had prompted it. "Albus," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the ease of someone who had occupied that position through countless discussions of school business and order affairs. "You look as though you've received troubling news." He gestured to the ministry correspondence that lay between them like an accusation waiting to be acknowledged. "The Department of Magical Law Enforcement has opened an investigation into Harry's living arrangements with the Dursleys. Amelia Bones is personally overseeing the matter." Something shifted in Minerva's expression, a flicker of what might have been satisfaction rather than surprise. When she spoke, her voice carried a careful neutrality that suggested she had been expecting this development for longer than he had realized. "And you are concerned about the implications for the blood protection," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "The protection requires that Harry view Privet Drive as his home," Dumbledore replied, feeling the weight of years of compromise settling around him like a familiar burden. "If the Ministry removes him from the Dursleys' custody, that magical bond will be severed. He will lose the one defense that has kept him safe from Voldemort's direct influence since infancy." Minerva was quiet for a long moment, and in her silence he heard an indictment that she was too tactful to voice directly. When she finally spoke, her words carried the kind of measured precision that indicated she had given considerable thought to the points she was about to make. "Albus, I have watched that boy return to school each September for 4 years. I have seen the way he flinches from unexpected kindness, the careful way he moves through the world as if he expects to be punished for taking up space. The protection you speak of may have kept him physically safe, but it has not kept him whole." Her observations struck him with the force of truths he had acknowledged privately, but never allowed himself to examine too closely. The boy who had faced down basilisks and dementors displayed a confidence in magical crises that contrasted sharply with his careful reticence in social situations, his apparent surprise when adults treated him with basic kindness. The protection had preserved his life, but at the cost of the security and emotional development that should have been his birthright. "You believe the investigation is justified," he said, recognizing in her tone the position she had already taken on the matter. "I believe that boy has paid enough for the sins of others," she replied with characteristic directness. "The protection you arranged kept him alive, but survival is not the same as living. If there is a way to keep him safe that does not require him to endure systematic mistreatment, then we have an obligation to find it." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, feeling the full weight of his 114 years in a way that had little to do with physical age. The choice before him was stark in its moral complexity. Maintain the protection that had kept Harry alive at the cost of his emotional well-being, or support the intervention that might restore his immediate safety while exposing him to dangers that could prove fatal. There were no good options, only degrees of compromise, and the hope that wisdom earned through decades of difficult decisions would guide him toward the path that served Harry's best interests, rather than his own need to maintain control over an increasingly complex situation. Outside his office windows, the grounds of Hogwarts stretched away in the late summer sunshine, peaceful and eternal in their beauty. Somewhere beyond those grounds, in Little Whinging, Harry Potter was living through another day of the careful isolation that had been the price of his protection. And in London, Amelia Bones was preparing to challenge arrangements that had stood unchallenged for 14 years. The time for maintaining the status quo through willful blindness had passed. Whatever came next, it would require him to choose between competing forms of protection for the boy who had already sacrificed so much for the greater good. The emergency meeting had been called with the kind of urgency that brought Order members from their scattered lives to Grimmauld Place with little advance notice, and even less information about what crisis required their immediate attention. The old house seemed to absorb their collective tension, its dark walls and oppressive atmosphere reflecting the gravity of whatever situation had prompted Dumbledore to abandon his usual careful scheduling in favor of immediate consultation. Sirius Black moved through his ancestral home with the restless energy of a man who had spent too many years confined within its walls, his footsteps echoing against the worn floorboards as he prepared the drawing room for the meeting that would determine Harry Potter's immediate future. At 35, he carried himself with the physical grace of someone who had survived Azkaban through sheer determination, but his eyes held the particular intensity that came from having too much personal investment in the outcome of decisions made by committee. The irony of using his family's house as headquarters for an organization dedicated to fighting the very ideologies the Blacks had championed for generations was not lost on him. But tonight, such considerations seemed trivial compared to the crisis that had brought them all together. Harry was in danger, and the adults who claimed responsibility for his protection were preparing to debate the most effective response, while the boy himself remained trapped in a situation that should never have been allowed to continue. Remus Lupin arrived first, his approach marked by the careful quiet that characterized all his movements during the days immediately following the full moon. At 35, he bore the accumulated weight of years spent managing his lycanthropy while maintaining his place in both the magical and mundane worlds, and his perspective on legal matters had been shaped by extensive experience with the complications that arose when magical individuals found themselves subject to both wizarding and Muggle authorities. "Sirius," he said, settling into one of the threadbare armchairs that had furnished this room for decades, "do we know the extent of what the Ministry has discovered?" "Enough to justify formal intervention, according to Dumbledore's message," Sirius replied, his voice carrying the barely controlled anger that had been building since he received word of the investigation. 14 years, Remus. 14 years that boy has been trapped with those people while we convinced ourselves that his safety required it. The accusation in his tone was directed as much at himself as at the others who had accepted Dumbledore's assurances about the necessity of Harry's placement with the Dursleys. Sirius had spent his years in Azkaban tormented by the knowledge that his failure to stop Peter Pettigrew had resulted in James and Lily's death. But learning that Harry's suffering had continued throughout his childhood added another layer of guilt that was almost unbearable. Other members began arriving in the careful intervals that Order security protocols required, each bringing their own perspective on the crisis and their own opinions about how it should be addressed. The drawing room gradually filled with the quiet conversations and careful positioning that preceded difficult discussions, as people who had learned to work together, despite fundamental disagreements, prepared to navigate another complex decision. Severus Snape entered last, his black robes billowing around him as he moved to the chair that provided the best view of all other participants while keeping his own back protected. His presence carried the particular tension that always accompanied gatherings where his loyalties might be questioned. But tonight his focus seemed entirely consumed by the implications of ministry intervention in Harry Potter's living arrangements. When Dumbledore finally arrived and called the meeting to order, his usual air of calm authority seemed strained by the weight of decisions he clearly wished he did not have to make. The explanation he provided was methodical and comprehensive, laying out the evidence that had prompted the DMLE investigation and the legal justification that supported potential intervention. "The question before us," he concluded, his voice carrying the measured tone that indicated he was presenting options rather than dictating solutions, "is whether we support the ministry's investigation or attempt to resolve this matter through our own channels." Sirius was on his feet before Dumbledore had finished speaking, his entire posture radiating the kind of barely contained fury that came from years of suppressed helplessness finally finding a target. Support it? We should have handled this ourselves years ago. That boy should never have been left in that situation for a single summer, let alone his entire childhood. And expose him to Voldemort's direct influence? Dumbledore asked quietly. The blood protection has kept him safe from magical threats that would have killed him within weeks of his parents' death. Safe? Sirius's voice rose with incredulity. You call what he's endured safe? The boy who faced down Dementors is flinching from his own relatives. The child we're supposed to be protecting has been systematically broken down by the very people charged with his care. Remus shifted in his chair, his expression thoughtful, as he considered the legal implications of the various courses of action available to them. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone who understood that good intentions were insufficient justification for actions that might have unintended consequences. The ministry's intervention creates complications we need to consider, he said, his tone diplomatic but firm. If the DMLE removes Harry from the Dursleys' custody, we lose control over his placement and protection. He could end up somewhere worse, or somewhere that makes him an easier target for Death Eaters. Anywhere would be better than where he is now, Sirius shot back, his frustration evident in every line of his body. At least in ministry custody he'd be treated as a human being, rather than an unwanted burden to be hidden away and forgotten. Snape's voice cut through the developing argument with characteristic coldness. Your sentiment is touching, Black, but your understanding of the situation is characteristically naive. The Dark Lord's return changes everything about Potter's vulnerability. The blood protection is not merely theoretical. It has prevented several attempts on the boy's life that you know nothing about. The revelation brought an immediate silence to the room, as Order members absorbed the implication that threats against Harry had been more immediate and frequent than most of them had realized. Snape continued with the clinical detachment that marked his most serious warnings. If Potter is removed from his relative's home, he becomes accessible to direct magical attack. The Dark Lord has been patient because he knows the blood protection makes certain approaches impossible. Remove that protection, and the boy becomes a target that no amount of ministry security can adequately defend. Then we protect him ourselves, Sirius said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. The Order has resources the ministry lacks. We can keep him safe while ensuring he's treated with the basic decency he should have received from the beginning. "Can we?" Dumbledore asked, his tone suggesting the question was more complex than Sirius wanted to acknowledge. "The protection provided by the blood bond is ancient magic, more powerful than anything we could construct through conventional means. Breaking it means accepting responsibility for consequences we may not be able to control." The debate that followed revealed the fundamental divisions within the Order about how to balance Harry's immediate welfare against his long-term survival. Some members supported intervention, regardless of the magical risks, arguing that the systematic abuse he had endured was an unacceptable price for any protection. Others maintained that preserving his life required accepting compromises that were morally difficult but practically necessary. As the discussion continued, it became clear that the Order was fracturing along lines that reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of sacrifice and protection. Those who had experienced persecution themselves tended to support immediate intervention, while those who had seen the full extent of Voldemort's capabilities worried about the implications of removing magical protections that could not be replaced. Through it all, Snape remained silent, except for his periodic warnings about the dangers they would face if the blood protection was broken. His perspective, informed by his unique position as a double agent, carried particular weight precisely because his loyalty to Harry's welfare was never questioned, even when his methods were controversial. The meeting ended without resolution, the Order members dispersing into the London night, with the understanding that events beyond their control were now shaping Harry Potter's future. The Ministry investigation would proceed regardless of their preferences, and their role would be to respond to whatever consequences emerged from actions they had not chosen but would be forced to address. In the aftermath of their departure, Grimmauld Place settled back into its familiar gloom, but the weight of unresolved decisions seemed to permeate every shadow and corner of the old house. The unmarked Ministry vehicles moved through the pre-dawn darkness of Surrey with the careful precision of a tactical operation that had been planned to the smallest detail. Amelia Bones sat in the lead car, reviewing the final operational briefing, while the suburban streets of Little Whinging passed by in a blur of identical houses and manicured lawns that spoke to the kind of aggressive conformity that served as both camouflage and prison for the family they were approaching. The warrant, tucked securely in her robes, carried the full authority of the Ministry of Magic and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But she understood that legal documents were only as effective as the people implementing them. The team she had assembled for this intervention represented years of careful selection, Aurors whose experience with both magical and Muggle environments made them uniquely qualified to handle the complexities they were about to face. Beside her, Nymphadora Tonks maintained the focused alertness that had characterized her throughout the planning phase, her natural hair color subdued to a professional brown that would draw no unwanted attention from the Muggle neighbors whose morning routines were already beginning in some of the surrounding houses. Her surveillance work had provided the intelligence that made this operation possible, and her metamorphmagus abilities would prove invaluable in managing the magical concealment that would be necessary once they began their approach. The other members of the team rode in the second vehicle, their presence a carefully calculated balance of experience and capability. Each had been selected not merely for their technical skills, but for their ability to maintain professional calm while dealing with potentially hostile guardians and a traumatized wizard child whose removal from his home would trigger complex, magical, and emotional consequences. As they turned onto Privet Drive, Amelia felt the familiar weight of responsibility that accompanied operations where the margin for error was effectively zero. The boy they were here to protect had already endured 14 years of systematic mistreatment, and any mistakes in the intervention could result in either escalated abuse or magical complications that might prove impossible to resolve. The street itself seemed to embody everything that was both appealing and oppressive about suburban respectability. Each house sat in perfect alignment with its neighbors, their gardens maintained with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested the residents valued appearance over substance. It was exactly the sort of environment where unpleasant truths might fester behind facades of desperate normalcy, hidden from casual observation by the collective determination to maintain standards that tolerated no deviation from established norms. Number 4 stood among its neighbors like a monument to the kind of willful blindness that allowed systematic abuse to continue unchallenged for years. The house proclaimed its respectability through every carefully maintained detail, from the pristine paintwork to the garden that showed no evidence of the conflict and misery that had been documented within its walls. Amelia signaled for the vehicles to stop several houses away, positioning them where they could observe their target while remaining inconspicuous to any neighbors who might be beginning their morning routines. The concealment charms that would hide their presence from Muggle observation required careful coordination, and she wanted to ensure that every aspect of their approach was properly managed before they committed to action. "Concealment protocols," she said quietly, and watched as Tonks began the complex spellwork that would render their presence effectively invisible to any non-magical observers. The magic settled around them like a familiar weight, creating a bubble of altered perception that would allow them to operate freely without triggering the kind of neighborhood curiosity that could complicate their mission. Inside Number 4 Privet Drive, Harry Potter was beginning another morning of the careful routine that had governed his summers for as long as he could remember. The early hour meant that the rest of the household was still asleep, granting him a brief period of relative peace before the day's demands and restrictions began in earnest. He moved quietly through his assigned tasks, the mundane labor that seemed designed more to keep him occupied than to serve any practical purpose. The work itself had long since ceased to bother him. What he found more difficult was the careful navigation of household dynamics that required him to remain perpetually alert to the moods and expectations of adults whose tolerance for his presence seemed to diminish with each passing year. The cupboard under the stairs had been replaced by the smallest bedroom in the house, but the upgrade in living space had not been accompanied by any meaningful improvement in his treatment. He was still an unwelcome burden to be managed, rather than a family member to be cherished, still subject to restrictions and punishments that seemed designed to remind him that his place in this household was both temporary and conditional. As he worked, Harry allowed his mind to drift to thoughts of Hogwarts and the magical world that felt more like home than any place he had ever lived. The contrast between his treatment at school and his summer existence had grown more pronounced each year, until the gap between the two realities seemed almost unbearable. At Hogwarts, he was respected, even celebrated for his abilities and achievements. Here, those same qualities were treated as sources of shame to be hidden and suppressed. The irony was not lost on him that the magical protection keeping him safe from the external threats required him to remain in an environment that posed its own forms of danger to his emotional and psychological well-being. He had never questioned the necessity of the arrangement, accepting it as one of the many aspects of his life that were determined by forces beyond his control, but the cost of that protection seemed to increase with each summer he endured. Outside, the DMLE team completed their final preparations with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all successful tactical operations. Each member understood their role in the intervention that would unfold over the next several hours, from the initial approach and service of the warrant to the complex process of removing Harry from the custody of guardians who would almost certainly resist any challenge to their authority. Amelia reviewed the legal documentation one final time, ensuring that every aspect of their authority was properly established and documented. The warrant had been crafted with particular attention to the magical complications they would face, acknowledging both the blood protection that currently shielded Harry and the potential consequences of breaking that ancient magic through their intervention. The photographs from Tonks's surveillance lay spread before her, each image serving as a reminder of why this operation was necessary despite its complexity. The boy in these pictures deserved better than the life he had been given, and it was her responsibility to ensure that he received the protection and care that should have been his birthright from the beginning. "Final approach," she said, and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the transition from planning to action. The team moved with practiced coordination, their movements concealed by the magic that rendered them effectively invisible to any Muggle observers who might be beginning their morning routines. As they approached number 4 Privet Drive, the morning sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the pristine street, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed somehow appropriate for an operation that would bring hidden truths into the harsh light of official scrutiny. The house that had served as both sanctuary and prison for Harry Potter was about to face a reckoning that had been 14 years in the making. Inside, Harry continued his quiet morning routine, unaware that the careful balance of his summer existence was about to be shattered by forces that would change everything about his relationship with the adult world. The protection that had kept him alive since infancy was about to be challenged by a different kind of protection, one that valued his immediate welfare over the complex, magical considerations that had governed his placement since childhood. The approach was nearly complete. Within minutes, the careful arrangements that had defined Harry Potter's life would face their first serious challenge, and the adults responsible for his care would discover that their actions had finally attracted the attention of authorities with both the power and the determination to intervene on his behalf. The morning that had begun like so many others was about to become the day that changed everything. The knock at the front door of number 4 Privet Drive came with the measured authority that immediately distinguished it from the polite social calls or routine deliveries that typically disturbed the household's carefully maintained routine. Harry looked up from his morning tasks, surprised by the early hour and the particular quality of the sound that seemed to carry implications beyond mere courtesy or commercial purpose. From upstairs came the immediate sounds of the adult household responding to this unexpected intrusion, footsteps moving with the kind of urgent irritation that suggested the arrival of unwanted visitors who had failed to respect the established boundaries of suburban privacy. Harry had learned over the years to read the subtle variations in household mood, and the tension that suddenly permeated the house spoke to concerns that went beyond simple annoyance at being disturbed during breakfast. The door opened with the reluctant caution that characterized all interactions between the Dursley household and the outside world, particularly when that world arrived without advance notice or apparent invitation. What followed was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch indefinitely, as if the normal flow of time had been suspended by the weight of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Amelia Bones stood on the pristine doorstep with the calm authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to people who preferred not to hear it. The warrant in her hand carried the full legal weight of the Ministry of Magic, but she understood that establishing her authority would require more than mere documentation. The man who faced her across the threshold radiated the kind of defensive hostility that came from years of living in fear that his carefully constructed normality might be challenged by forces beyond his control. "Mr. Dursley," she said, her voice carrying the formal precision that marked all official ministry business, "I am Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I have a warrant to investigate concerns about the welfare of Harry Potter during his residence in this household." The words fell into the morning air like stones dropped into still water, their impact spreading through the household in waves that seemed to affect every person within hearing. Harry felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of shock and disbelief that anyone from the magical world had finally taken notice of his summer circumstances. After 14 years of careful isolation from anything that might remind the Dursleys of his true nature, the official magical world had arrived at their front door with questions that could no longer be ignored. Behind Amelia, the rest of the DMLE team maintained their positions with professional readiness, their presence serving as visible evidence that this was not a social call or a matter that could be dismissed through the usual household strategies of denial and misdirection. Each member understood their role in an intervention that had been planned down to the smallest detail, from the legal documentation that justified their authority to the magical concealment that kept their activities hidden from curious neighbors. The man in the doorway seemed to expand with indignation, his bulk filling the frame as if physical presence alone could somehow repel this invasion of his domestic sovereignty. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of bluster that had intimidated Harry for years, but now seemed pitifully inadequate when faced with official authority, backed by legal documentation and professional competence. "Warrant? I don't recognize any authority you people might claim to have. This is England, not some backward place where you can just show up and make demands based on your ridiculous nonsense." Amelia had anticipated this response, understanding that people who had spent years avoiding accountability for their actions rarely welcomed its sudden arrival. She produced the warrant with movements that emphasized its official nature, allowing the legal weight of the document to speak for itself before providing the explanation that would remove any doubt about her authority to proceed. "The warrant is issued under the International Statute of Secrecy and the provisions for magical law enforcement in mixed communities," she said, her tone remaining professionally neutral, despite the obvious hostility she faced. "Your household contains a minor magical person, which places certain aspects of his welfare under ministry jurisdiction. We have evidence suggesting that jurisdiction needs to be exercised." From his position in the kitchen, Harry listened to this exchange with growing amazement that gradually transformed into something approaching hope. The official recognition of his magical status, the formal acknowledgement that someone in authority cared about his treatment, represented a validation that he had never dared to expect. After years of being told that his very nature was a source of shame to be hidden from the world, here were representatives of that magical world treating his welfare as a matter of legitimate concern. The confrontation in the doorway escalated as the full implications of the ministry's presence became clear. The careful balance of power that had governed Harry's summer existence for 14 years was crumbling under the pressure of official scrutiny, and the adults who had exercised unchallenged authority over his daily life now found themselves facing questions they had never expected to answer. Evidence? The word emerged with the kind of defensive anger that suggested guilt struggling against exposure. "That boy has been housed and fed and kept out of trouble for years. We've done our duty by him, more than most people would have managed with such a difficult situation." Amelia consulted the documentation that Tonks's surveillance had provided, each photograph and recorded incident representing evidence that would be difficult to dismiss or rationalize. When she spoke again, her voice carried the clinical precision of someone presenting facts that spoke for themselves. "Our investigation has documented systematic emotional abuse, inadequate nutrition, inappropriate labor assignments, and social isolation that goes far beyond reasonable precautions. These patterns constitute mistreatment of a minor under both magical and Muggle law." The formal presentation of evidence created a shift in the confrontation's dynamics, as the weight of official documentation made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. Harry, listening from the kitchen, felt a strange mixture of vindication and exposure, as years of private suffering were transformed into matters of public record. The careful strategies he had developed to minimize conflict and avoid punishment were suddenly irrelevant in the face of external authority that treated his welfare as a legitimate concern. The arrival of other household members added new layers of complexity to the confrontation, as the adults who had participated in or witnessed his treatment now faced the possibility that their actions might have legal consequences they had never considered. The suburban privacy that had allowed systematic abuse to continue unchallenged for years was no protection against official investigation backed by proper authority. As the argument in the doorway continued, with increasing volume and decreasing coherence on the part of his guardians, Harry began to understand that his summer existence was about to change in ways he could barely comprehend. The magical world that had always felt distant and inaccessible during his time at Privet Drive had finally reached across the gap that separated his two realities, bringing with it the possibility of protection he had never dared to hope for. The DMLE team maintained their professional composure throughout the escalating confrontation, their training and experience evident in the way they handled both the legal complexities and the emotional volatility of the situation. Each member understood that they were not merely serving a warrant, but dismantling a system of abuse that had operated without challenge for more than a decade. When Amelia finally stepped across the threshold, her entry into the house represented more than a simple exercise of legal authority. It marked the moment when Harry Potter's protection shifted from the informal arrangements that had governed his childhood to the formal mechanisms of magical law enforcement, with all the complications and possibilities that such a change would bring. The confrontation that had been years in the making was finally underway, and the careful balance of power that had defined Harry's summer existence would never be the same. The photographs spread across the kitchen table looked like evidence from someone else's life, each image capturing moments of a reality that Harry had lived through but never seen from the outside. Amelia Bones arranged them with clinical precision, creating a visual narrative of systematic mistreatment that transformed his private suffering into documented fact. The boy in these pictures bore little resemblance to the confident wizard who had faced down Dementors and testified before the Wizengamot, and seeing himself through the lens of official investigation was both validating and deeply unsettling. These images were taken during surveillance of this household, Amelia explained, her voice maintaining the professional neutrality that characterized all her interactions with victims of abuse. They document patterns of treatment that constitute grounds for immediate intervention under both magical and Muggle law. However, any formal charges will require your testimony about the specific incidents and circumstances involved. Harry stared at the photographs with growing amazement, each one representing moments when he had felt most isolated and vulnerable, unaware that anyone was witnessing the careful degradation that had shaped his summer existence for years. The validation of his experience was overwhelming, but it came paired with the recognition that speaking officially about his treatment would transform private shame into public record. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to testify against them? They're my family." The words felt strange in his mouth. The concept of family applied to people who had made their resentment of his existence clear through every interaction since childhood. But the bonds created by years of shared residence, however unwilling, created their own form of loyalty that was difficult to dismiss even when faced with evidence of systematic mistreatment. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her expression softening in a way that suggested she understood the complexity of emotions involved in asking abuse victims to speak against their guardians. Harry, what you call loyalty, the law recognizes as a trauma response. People who have been systematically mistreated often feel protective of their abusers, particularly when those abusers are the only family they have known. From his position near the doorway, Dudley Dursley watched this exchange with an expression that mixed confusion with something approaching shame. At 15, he was old enough to understand that the adults in his household had done things that outside authorities found unacceptable, but young enough to struggle with the implications of that recognition for his understanding of his family and his own role in Harry's treatment. "They never hit you," Dudley said suddenly, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone trying to minimize actions he was beginning to recognize as wrong. They were strict. Because of the freaky stuff." Harry looked at his cousin with surprise, recognizing in that halting defense an acknowledgement that their shared household had been built on foundations that would not bear external scrutiny. It was the closest thing to an admission that Dudley had ever offered about the nature of Harry's treatment, and it came with the kind of reluctant honesty that suggested the intervention was forcing all of them to confront truths they had carefully avoided. "Physical violence isn't the only form of abuse," Amelia said, addressing both boys with the kind of careful explanation that suggested she had experience helping young people understand concepts they had never been equipped to recognize. Systematic emotional mistreatment, social isolation, and the use of basic needs like food and shelter as tools of control all constitute abuse under the law. She gestured to the photographs that documented these patterns with bureaucratic precision. The evidence shows that Harry was subjected to all of these forms of mistreatment, consistently and over an extended period. That constitutes grounds for removal from this household and potential criminal charges against his guardians. The kitchen fell into silence as the implications of this explanation settled over the people it most directly affected. Harry struggled to process the idea that his normal summer existence constituted criminal behavior, while Dudley grappled with the recognition that his family's treatment of his cousin had been far worse than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Into this silence came footsteps on the stairs, followed by the appearance of the woman whose acceptance of responsibility for Harry had sealed the blood protection that kept him alive. She entered the kitchen with the careful composure of someone who understood that her world was ending, but was determined to maintain dignity throughout its destruction. "So," she said, her voice carrying the bitter resignation of someone who had spent years dreading this moment, "they've finally come for him." Amelia turned to face her with professional courtesy that contained no warmth. "Mrs. Dursley, you're aware of the charges being brought regarding your treatment of Harry Potter during his residence in your home?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it the weight of 14 years of choices that could no longer be hidden behind suburban respectability. When the response came, it was delivered with the kind of defensive anger that had characterized the household's approach to anything connected with the magical world. "We did what we had to do," she said, her voice rising with emotions that had been suppressed for years. "Do you think it was easy, taking in that boy after what happened to Lily? Living every day with reminders of the world that killed my sister and destroyed any chance of a normal life for this family?" The outburst revealed layers of resentment and fear that had shaped Harry's treatment since childhood, but it also contained an admission that the adults responsible for his care had allowed their own trauma to justify systematic mistreatment of a child who had no control over the circumstances that brought him into their lives. Harry listened to this explanation with growing understanding of the dynamics that had governed his existence, but also with recognition that understanding the reasons for abuse didn't excuse its continuation. The adults who claimed to have protected him had instead used him as a target for frustrations and fears that should have been addressed through other means. They were afraid, he said quietly, speaking more to himself than to anyone else in the room. All these years they were afraid of me. Dudley shifted uncomfortably at this observation, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand connections he had never recognized before. "Not afraid of you," he said slowly, working through concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about the family dynamics he had grown up with. "Afraid of what you represented. The world that wasn't normal." It was perhaps the most perceptive thing his cousin had ever said, and it came with the kind of reluctant honesty that suggested the intervention was forcing all of them to examine truths they had spent years avoiding. The recognition that fear rather than malice had driven much of his mistreatment didn't excuse it, but it provided context that made his decision about testimony even more complicated. Amelia observed this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood that family dynamics in abuse cases were rarely simple matters of good and evil. When she spoke again, her voice carried the patient explanation of someone who had guided many victims through similar decisions. "Harry, you have choices to make about how you want to proceed. You can provide formal testimony that will support criminal charges against your guardians, or you can choose to have this matter handled as a welfare intervention without pursuing prosecution. Either way, you cannot remain in this household." The choice she presented was both liberating and terrifying, offering him agency in a situation where he had never had control while requiring him to take responsibility for consequences that would affect everyone in the room. The boy who had spent his childhood accepting whatever treatment adults chose to impose was being asked to actively shape his own future for the first time. As he looked around the kitchen that had been the site of so many small cruelties and careful degradations, Harry began to understand that his decision would represent more than just a choice about legal proceedings. It would determine whether he continued to define himself through the lens of other people's fears and limitations, or began the difficult process of asserting his own worth in a world that had finally acknowledged his right to protection and care. The photographs on the table seemed to stare back at him, each one representing a moment when he had endured rather than resisted, accepted rather than challenged. Now, for the first time, he had the power to ensure that those moments of private suffering might serve a larger purpose in preventing others from facing similar treatment. The choice was his to make, and for the first time in his life, the adults around him were waiting for his decision rather than imposing their will upon him. The formal statement room at the ministry had been designed to put victims at ease, its soft lighting and comfortable furnishings a deliberate contrast to the stark interrogation chambers used for questioning suspects. Harry sat across from Amelia Bones with a quill in his hand and parchment spread before him, the weight of official documentation transforming his private suffering into evidence that would support whatever legal action the department chose to pursue. "Take your time," Amelia said, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who understood that trauma did not adhere to bureaucratic schedules. "This statement will form the foundation of any charges brought against your guardians. It needs to be complete and accurate, but it also needs to be something you can stand behind if this matter proceeds to formal trial." The concept of trial seemed surreal, the idea that his summer existence might become the subject of legal proceedings that would transform private shame into public record. For 14 years, his treatment at Privet Drive had existed in a carefully maintained bubble of suburban secrecy, hidden from external scrutiny by the collective determination to maintain appearances that tolerated no deviation from established norms. Now, that bubble had been shattered by official investigation, and the adults who had exercised unchallenged authority over his daily life were facing consequences they had never anticipated. The man who had made Harry's existence a burden to be endured rather than a life to be cherished was at this moment being processed through the machinery of magical law enforcement, his freedom conditional on cooperation with an investigation he had never expected to face. Harry began to write, each sentence a careful excavation of memories he had spent years trying to minimize or forget. The cupboard under the stairs, with its spider-filled darkness and musty smell that had marked his earliest understanding of his place in the household. The systematic denial of food that served as punishment for any display of the magical abilities that marked him as fundamentally different from the normal family his guardians desperately wanted to be. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluency as he found his voice in describing experiences that had never been validated by external recognition. Each incident recorded in official documentation represented a moment when he had chosen endurance over resistance, acceptance over protest, understanding that survival required making himself as small and unobtrusive as possible. The worst part, he wrote, pausing to consider how to express concepts that had never been articulated before, was not the restrictions or the extra work, or even the way they talked about my parents. The worst part was understanding that they saw my very existence as a burden they resented having to bear, and that nothing I could do would ever change that fundamental assessment. The statement grew longer as he documented patterns of mistreatment that had seemed normal because they were all he had ever known. The careful isolation that kept him separated from any sources of support or comparison. The systematic undermining of his self-worth through constant reminders that his magical nature made him a dangerous aberration to be contained rather than a child to be loved. As he wrote, Harry became aware that this formal testimony represented more than just evidence for legal proceedings. It was the first time he had been asked to articulate his own experience from his own perspective, to assert his understanding of events, rather than simply accepting whatever interpretation adults chose to impose upon them. Meanwhile, across London, news of the DMLE investigation was beginning to ripple through the magical community in ways that would have far-reaching implications for everyone connected to the case. At Hogwarts, where the start of term preparations were underway, Susan Bones received an owl from her aunt that transformed her understanding of current events and her family's role in shaping them. The letter was characteristically direct, written in Amelia's precise script, with the kind of clinical detachment that marked all her official communications. But underlying the professional language, Susan could detect the personal investment that had driven her aunt to take action that would inevitably attract political scrutiny and potential criticism. The department has initiated proceedings regarding the welfare of Harry Potter, the letter explained, providing context that made Susan's stomach clench with recognition of how serious the situation must have been to warrant such intervention. Evidence gathered during our investigation indicates systematic mistreatment over an extended period. Potter has provided testimony that will support formal charges against his guardians. Susan set the letter down with hands that trembled slightly, understanding for the first time that the boy she had known as a fellow student, someone she had worked alongside in defense against the dark arts classes, had been living a double existence that none of them had recognized or understood. The confident wizard who had taught them to cast Patronuses and led them against Death Eaters had been returning each summer to circumstances that would have broken most people their age. The realization that her aunt had been the one to finally intervene filled Susan with a complicated mixture of pride and guilt. Pride that Amelia had possessed the courage and authority to challenge arrangements that had been accepted without question by everyone else in positions of responsibility. Guilt that it had taken so long for anyone to recognize what should have been obvious signs of systematic mistreatment. Back at the ministry, Harry's statement had grown to encompass the full scope of his summer experiences, each page representing years of careful documentation that would serve as the foundation for whatever justice the legal system could provide. The process of articulating his experience had been emotionally exhausting, but it had also been strangely liberating to have his perspective officially recognized and recorded. "This is remarkable testimony," Amelia said, when he finally set down his quill, her voice carrying the professional appreciation of someone who understood how difficult such statements were to produce. "You've documented patterns of abuse that constitute clear violations of both magical and Muggle law. This evidence will support serious charges against the adults responsible for your care." The phrase, "adults responsible for your care," struck Harry as particularly significant, the formal recognition that the people who had mistreated him had violated fundamental obligations that came with their position as guardians. For years he had been told that he should be grateful for their reluctant hospitality, that his magical nature made him a burden that they had generously agreed to bear. Now, official authority was telling him that those same adults had failed in their most basic duties, that their treatment of him had been not merely unkind, but actually criminal. The validation was overwhelming, but it came paired with the recognition that justice would require him to continue participating in proceedings that would make his private suffering part of the public record. "What happens now?" he asked, understanding that his testimony was just the beginning of a process that would determine not only the fate of his guardians, but also the shape of his own future. Amelia consulted the documentation that had accumulated throughout the investigation, each piece of evidence representing another step in the methodical construction of a legal case that would hold his guardians accountable for their choices. "Your statement will be reviewed by Ministry Legal Counsel, and formal charges will be filed within the week. Your guardians will be given the opportunity to respond to the evidence, but the documentation we have gathered makes denial difficult to sustain." She paused, considering the broader implications of the case they had constructed through careful investigation and Harry's courageous testimony. "More importantly, for your immediate welfare, you cannot return to their custody regardless of how the legal proceedings unfold. Alternative arrangements will need to be made for your protection and care." The promise of alternative arrangements represented a fundamental shift in Harry's understanding of his place in the world. For the first time since childhood, adults in positions of authority were taking responsibility for ensuring his safety and well-being, rather than simply accepting whatever arrangements others had made on his behalf. As he left the ministry that evening, Harry carried with him the knowledge that justice was finally beginning to function on his behalf. The boy who had endured years of systematic mistreatment in silence had found his voice, and that voice would now serve to ensure that the adults who had failed in their duty of care would face the consequences of their choices. The legal machinery that would determine their fate was now in motion, driven by testimony that transformed private suffering into public accountability. The ancient magic that had protected Harry Potter since infancy began to unravel the moment he walked away from Privet Drive in the company of ministry officials, its dissolution as inevitable as sunrise and just as irreversible. Albus Dumbledore felt the protective bonds snap with the particular sensation that accompanied the breaking of magic older than recorded history, each severed connection reverberating through spells he had spent 14 years maintaining and reinforcing. He stood in his office at Hogwarts, surrounded by the instruments that monitored various aspects of the magical world's stability, and watched as the delicate silver devices that had tracked Harry's protection for over a decade went dark one by one. The boy no longer considered Privet Drive his home, and without that emotional connection, the blood protection sealed by Petunia Dursley's reluctant acceptance could no longer function. The irony was not lost on him that justice for Harry had come at the cost of the magical shield that had kept him alive since childhood. The intervention that rescued him from systematic abuse had also exposed him to dangers that could prove far more lethal than anything his guardians had inflicted. It was a trade-off that Dumbledore had always known might eventually become necessary, but he had hoped for more time to prepare alternative defenses. "How long do we have?" Minerva McGonagall asked from her position near the office fireplace, her voice carrying the practical urgency that had made her his most trusted deputy for decades. At 59, she had lived through enough crises to understand that magical protections existed for reasons that transcended sentiment or legal considerations. "The dissolution is already complete," Dumbledore replied, his tone reflecting the weight of implications that stretched far beyond Harry's immediate situation. "Voldemort will sense the change within hours, if he hasn't already. The protection that has shielded Harry from direct magical attack for 14 years no longer exists." The statement fell into the office like a stone dropped into still water, its impact spreading through the assembled Order members in waves of recognition and concern. Each person present understood that they were facing a fundamental shift in the balance of power that had governed the wizarding world since Voldemort's return, and that their response to this crisis would determine whether Harry Potter survived to face the destiny that awaited him. "Then we protect him ourselves," Sirius Black said, his voice carrying the fierce determination that had characterized his approach to Harry's welfare since escaping from Azkaban. At 35, he moved with the restless energy of someone who had spent too many years unable to act on his protective instincts, and the opportunity to finally take direct responsibility for his godson's safety brought out every aspect of his combative nature. "With what?" Remus Lupin asked quietly, his tone carrying the careful realism that had kept him alive through years of managing his lycanthropy in a world hostile to his condition. "The blood protection was ancient magic, more powerful than anything we can construct through conventional means. Our alternatives will be limited compared to what he's losing." The question struck at the heart of their dilemma, the recognition that replacing Harry's lost protection would require resources and magical knowledge that might not be available to them. The Order of the Phoenix, for all its dedication and expertise, was fundamentally a resistance organization rather than a magical research institution. Their strength lay in courage and determination rather than the kind of ancient knowledge that had created the blood protection. Dumbledore moved to the window that overlooked the grounds of Hogwarts, his gaze taking in the familiar landscape, while his mind wrestled with protective options that all carried significant limitations. "The school itself offers sanctuary," he said, speaking more to himself than to the others present. "The wards here are extensive and have been strengthened over centuries. Harry would be safe within these boundaries." "But only within these boundaries," McGonagall observed, her practical nature immediately identifying the restrictions that would come with such protection. "He cannot remain at Hogwarts permanently, and any movement beyond the school grounds would expose him to attack." The conversation continued around strategies that offered partial protection at best, each option carrying compromises that highlighted the unique nature of what had been lost. The blood protection had not merely been powerful, it had been comprehensive, shielding Harry from direct magical assault regardless of his location or activities. No combination of conventional defensive magic could replicate that level of coverage. As the Order members debated alternatives, Harry Potter sat in a secure room at the Ministry, processing the reality of his changed circumstances with the kind of careful attention he had learned to apply to situations beyond his control. The explanation Dumbledore had provided about the blood protection had been thorough and educational, but it had also made clear that his rescue from the Dursleys had come at a cost that would reshape every aspect of his future. The protection that had kept him alive since infancy was gone, sacrificed to end the systematic abuse that had marked his childhood. It was a trade-off that he understood intellectually, but the emotional implications were more complex. The knowledge that his safety now depended entirely on the vigilance and skill of others created a different kind of vulnerability than he had ever experienced before. "You understand what this means for your movement and activities," Amelia Bones had explained earlier, her voice carrying the professional concern of someone who took responsibility for the welfare of those under her protection. "Until alternative security arrangements can be established, you will need to remain in locations that can be adequately defended against magical attack." The restrictions she described were comprehensive, transforming him from someone who had enjoyed relative freedom within the magical world to someone who would require constant protection and careful management of his exposure to potential threats. It was another form of imprisonment, albeit one imposed by care rather than resentment. But as he considered the implications of his changed status, Harry found that he could accept these new limitations in ways that his summer restrictions had never been acceptable. The difference lay in the motivation behind them. These protections were designed to keep him safe rather than to make him convenient, implemented by people who valued his welfare rather than merely tolerating his existence. The evening brought emergency meetings throughout the magical community, as news of the protection's collapse spread among those with the knowledge and resources to understand its implications. The boy who had been hidden in plain sight for 14 years was now exposed in ways that would require immediate and comprehensive response from everyone committed to his survival. In the depths of whatever stronghold currently sheltered him, Tom Riddle felt the ancient magic snap with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years probing defenses he could not penetrate. The blood protection that had frustrated his attempts to reach Potter directly was gone, leaving the boy vulnerable to approaches that had been impossible since the night his parents died. The hunt that had been constrained by magical barriers older than his own considerable power could now begin in earnest, and the boy who had survived the killing curse would discover whether his luck and skill were sufficient to protect him when luck and ancient magic no longer served that purpose. At Hogwarts, Dumbledore concluded the emergency meeting with assignments that would transform the Order from a resistance organization into a protection detail. Every member now tasked with ensuring that Harry Potter survived long enough to fulfill whatever role destiny had prepared for him. The magical protection that had governed the boy's life since childhood was gone, and their response to that crisis would determine whether the wizarding world's best hope for victory would live to see his next birthday. The careful balance of power that had kept Harry alive through 14 summers at Privet Drive had been shattered by the intervention that saved him from systematic abuse. Now the adults who had finally acted to protect his immediate welfare would discover whether their conventional magic and mortal determination could replace the ancient power that had shielded him since infancy. The protection crisis was complete, and the new vulnerabilities it created would test every resource and relationship that remained to them in the struggle against the darkness that had already claimed too many lives. 3 weeks after his removal from Privet Drive, Harry Potter woke to sunlight streaming through windows that belonged to a room where he was genuinely welcome, in a house where his presence was considered a gift rather than a burden. The contrast with his previous summers was so profound that he sometimes caught himself listening for the familiar sounds of resentment and obligation that had marked his morning routines for 14 years, only to be reminded that those sounds belonged to a life he would never have to live again. Grimmauld Place had been transformed from a reluctant headquarters into something approaching a home, its oppressive atmosphere lifted by the presence of people who had chosen to be there, rather than simply accepting their circumstances with bitter resignation. The house still carried the weight of its dark history, but that history no longer defined the relationships within its walls or the quality of care extended to those who sought refuge there. Sirius moved through his ancestral home with energy that spoke to purposes beyond mere survival. His attention focused on creating an environment where Harry could process the trauma of his childhood while building toward a future that offered genuine possibilities for happiness and fulfillment. At 35, he had finally found a way to channel his protective instincts into practical action, and the opportunity to care for his godson properly had given new meaning to his existence. "Any nightmares?" Sirius asked, as Harry joined him in the kitchen for breakfast, his voice carrying the careful attention of someone who understood that healing from systematic abuse required patience and vigilance rather than simple good intentions. "Fewer each night," Harry replied, accepting the offer of food with the kind of natural ease that had taken weeks to develop. The systematic restriction of meals that had marked his summers at Privet Drive had created reflexive caution around eating that was slowly giving way to the understanding that food was now offered freely rather than as a privilege to be earned through careful behavior. The transformation in his relationship with basic necessities was perhaps the most tangible evidence of how profoundly his circumstances had changed. Sleep came without the anxiety of wondering what punishment tomorrow might bring for infractions he had not yet committed. Meals were shared rather than grudgingly provided. His opinions were solicited rather than actively discouraged, and his magical abilities were celebrated rather than treated as sources of shame that needed to be hidden from the world. The legal proceedings that had formalized his removal from the Dursley household had concluded the previous week with results that reflected both the strength of the evidence and the seriousness with which the magical justice system regarded crimes against children. The systematic abuse that had been carefully documented through Tonks's surveillance and Harry's testimony had resulted in consequences that would ensure his former guardians understood the weight of their choices. More importantly for Harry's emotional recovery, the formal legal validation of his experience had provided external confirmation that his suffering had been real and unjustified. The adults who had told him for years that he should be grateful for their reluctant care had been held officially accountable for treatment that violated both magical and Muggle standards for the protection of children. At the Ministry of Magic, Amelia Bones sat in her office, reviewing the final documentation from the Potter case with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from seeing justice properly served. The investigation that had begun with her suspicions about a 15-year-old boy's living conditions had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how the magical community had failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members, and the lessons learned would inform her department's approach to similar cases for years to come. The photographs from Tonks's surveillance lay filed away now, their evidentiary purpose served, but Amelia kept one image on her desk as a reminder of why such investigations mattered. The picture showed Harry Potter working in the garden at Privet Drive with the careful precision of someone who had learned that drawing attention to himself would bring consequences he could not escape. The boy in that photograph bore little resemblance to the confident young wizard she had interviewed during the formal proceedings. The transformation in Harry's demeanor over the past 3 weeks had been remarkable to witness, each meeting revealing new aspects of his personality that had been suppressed by years of systematic discouragement. The careful reticence that had marked their initial interactions had gradually given way to the kind of natural curiosity and engagement that should have characterized his development from childhood. "Ma'am," Tonks said, entering the office with the kind of purposeful energy that had characterized her work throughout the investigation. "The final reports have been processed and filed. The case is officially closed." Amelia nodded, understanding that the administrative conclusion represented only one aspect of a situation that would have lasting implications for everyone involved. And Potter's adjustment to his new circumstances? Better than anyone expected, Tonks replied, her voice carrying genuine warmth as she considered the boy whose suffering had prompted their intervention. He's staying with Black at Grimmauld Place, with Order members providing security and support. The change in him has been remarkable to watch. The report confirmed what Amelia had observed during her own interactions with Harry, the gradual emergence of qualities that had been carefully suppressed during his years with the Dursleys: confidence without arrogance, curiosity without recklessness, kindness without the desperate eagerness to please that often marked abuse survivors. The boy who had been systematically diminished by people who should have cherished him was beginning to discover who he might become when surrounded by genuine care and protection. "There's something else," Tonks continued, her expression shifting to reflect concerns that went beyond the immediate case. "The protection issues we discussed. Dumbledore's been working on alternative arrangements, but they're necessarily more complex than what existed before." Amelia had been briefed on the magical complications created by Harry's removal from Privet Drive, the ancient protections that had been sacrificed to end his abuse. The trade-off had been necessary, but it had created security challenges that would require ongoing vigilance and resources from everyone committed to his survival. "The Order is prepared to provide comprehensive protection," she said, reviewing the security arrangements that had been coordinated between the Ministry and the unofficial organization that had taken responsibility for Harry's welfare. "It's not the same as what he had before, but it's more than adequate for his immediate needs." The conversation continued around practical details that would govern Harry's future, but underlying all such discussions was the recognition that the boy who had been hidden and diminished for 14 years was finally free to discover his full potential. The rescue from systematic abuse had created vulnerabilities that would require careful management, but it had also removed the psychological barriers that had prevented him from developing into the person he was meant to become. That evening, as Harry sat in the renovated library at Grimmauld Place, with books spread before him and the comfortable sounds of a functioning household around him, he found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had transformed his existence so completely. The woman who had presided over his disciplinary hearing had seen something in his testimony that prompted her to look more closely at his circumstances, and that attention had ultimately led to his freedom from a situation he had never thought to question. The gratitude he felt toward Amelia Bones and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement went beyond simple appreciation for their intervention. For the first time in his life, adult authority had functioned to protect rather than restrict him, had validated his experience rather than dismissing it, had acted to ensure his welfare rather than merely maintaining convenient arrangements that served others' purposes. The relationship he was developing with lawful authority represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of how the world could function when institutions operated according to their stated purposes, rather than the political conveniences that had governed his childhood. The Ministry officials who had investigated his situation and the Order members who now provided his security were demonstrating through their actions that adults could be trusted to act in his best interests rather than their own. As he worked through the advanced magical theory that would prepare him for his final years at Hogwarts, Harry understood that his education was no longer something that had to be carefully balanced against the demands and restrictions of people who resented his existence. The time and energy he had spent managing household dynamics designed to make him invisible could now be directed toward discovering what he might accomplish when supported rather than hindered by the adults around him. The boy who had survived the killing curse and lived through 14 years of systematic abuse was finally free to become the wizard he had always had the potential to be. The intervention that had rescued him from Privet Drive had created new challenges and vulnerabilities, but it had also restored possibilities that had been denied to him since childhood. The future stretched ahead, with uncertainties and dangers that would require all his courage and skill to navigate. But for the first time in his memory, he would face those challenges with the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who valued his welfare above their own convenience. The foundations of his new life were built on care rather than obligation, protection rather than containment, and the belief that he deserved happiness rather than merely survival. It was more than enough to build a life upon, and more than he had ever dared to hope for during the long summers at Privet Drive, when hope itself had seemed